Hello, and welcome back to It's a Very Exciting Time, a podcast by a UFO nerd and its tolerant friend. My name is Scott, and I've been fascinated by the phenomenon my whole life.
And my name is Chuck. I'm an aerospace nerd and a tolerant friend.
We started this podcast because since 2017, there have been shocking revelations, from news of secret Pentagon programs to confirmed Navy videos of astonishing craft. In a nutshell, now that the government has admitted that UFOs are real,
Or at least that the videos were authentic.
it raises a natural question. If UFOs are real, what else? Suddenly, some of these other parts of the phenomenon that seemed unlikely are pulled into the realm of the possible.
Right? They may still be unlikely, but there's so many explanations for these stories. Even if the truth is more mundane than you're hoping, if any of it turns out to be true, whew,
Woo! It's a very exciting time. Oh my God. Chuck?
yeah, yeah. Wait, hang on. I want to start. I want to just start out and say thank you. I know this took a lot. Scott has been doing episode prep for the last 3 hours and deserves some freaking credit for that. That's amazing. Thank you.
Oh my God. It has been a buck wild week.
Yeah.
So let me give you the little teaser of what we're going to talk about today, and then I'll
Okay.
talk about what made it crazy. So a new article dropped on the debrief on Monday,
Yeah.
so just a few days ago. It was a new article from Leslie Kane and Ralph Blumenthal, who are names you probably recognize
Yeah.
from
This.
the now legendary 2017 New York Times story that
Yeah.
broke the world open that, like, oh, hey, the government is still taking UFOs
Yeah.
seriously, despite saying they're not.
Yeah.
Um, so, yeah, Kane and Blumenthal back at it again. That's
Yeah.
great news. Um, it's a little weird that it's on the debrief and not the New York Times, but we'll get into it
Yeah.
later. But
Okay. Cool.
here's kind of the byline. This is actually the first three paragraphs of the story, but they just they hit the nail on the head. A former intelligence official turned whistleblower has given Congress and the intelligence community inspector general extensive classified information about deeply covert programs that he says possess retrieved, intact, and partially intact craft of non human origin.
Hmm.
The information, he says, has been illegally withheld from Congress, and he
Okay.
filed a complaint alleging that he suffered illegal retaliation for his confidential disclosures.
Oh.
Other intelligence, yeah, other intelligence officials, both active and retired, with knowledge of these programs through their work in various agencies, have independently provided similar corroborating information both on and off the record.
Interesting. Holy shit. Yeah. I I feel like if you had told me this 9 months ago or whenever we started the podcast, I'd be like, yeah, show me the money. But now I'm
Mhm.
like, actually, that sounds like a pretty big deal.
It is the big deal. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. We're going to talk about this is the only thing we're talking about today. So
Okay.
just to be clear, we're going to get into this a lot, but like this is easily the biggest UFO story since 2017.
Okay.
Like
All right.
2017 kind of kickstarted this whole new wave of like,
Yeah.
oh shit, there might be something here. This is arguably a bigger story. Now, it is still settling out. We
Hmm.
we don't know for sure what all's going to come of it. We don't know if it's true. We're going to
Yeah.
talk about all of that today. But if any of this is true, this is earth shattering.
Yeah.
Like it's absolutely bonkers. Now, one thing you may ask is, wait a minute, haven't we heard all of these claims before? Like, didn't you do an episode on Bob Lazar talking about like Area
Yeah.
51 and crashed UFO recovery and everything? And yeah, you're right. The rumors of crash recovery teams and reverse engineering efforts
Right.
are not new. We have talked about it repeatedly on this
Yeah.
program. But there's two reasons why it's different this time. One, every time we've talked about it on the show before, it has been rumor and speculation.
Mm.
And the one guy who kind of has his name attached to this, Bob Lazar,
Uh-huh.
has been pretty thoroughly debunked. I'm
Yeah.
not 100% sold that he's a total scam artist,
Yeah.
but there is plenty of reason to doubt what Bob Lazar says.
Okay.
Bob Lazar says he studied science at this university and he went here and he took these classes, and there's no record of that. He says he worked at Area 51 and there's no record of that. He says he saw these things and there's no corroborating witnesses. People
Suspicious.
have come up. Yeah, he's not the most credible witness. And that's without even getting into the stuff that just kind of makes him a sketchy guy independently, like the whole brothel thing. Like,
Yeah. Oh, right.
Lazar
Yeah.
is a weird guy, right?
Yeah.
What makes this different from Lazar, it's all come out first in sworn testimony and signed affidavits. There are
Mm.
very real consequences for lying here. Where
Okay.
Bob Lazar just appeared on the news. This guy went to the inspector general. This guy went to Congress.
Yeah.
He is facing actual severe criminal penalties if it turns out he's just making this shit up.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So, and that even makes more sense. Like he didn't go to the news and give all these details. It seems like what he did feels very governmental. He made an official complaint. It's like,
Yeah, yeah,
like that feels really different than,
yeah,
yeah. I think that's interesting.
yeah. We're gonna dig into that a lot, but why don't we ease off the
Okay.
gas a little bit? Let's start by just talking about who is this dude,
Yeah.
right? So, the whistleblower's name is David Grusch. He's a 36-year-old guy. He is a decorated combat officer with the U.S. Air Force. He fought in Afghanistan. Um, from 2016 to 2021, he was a senior intelligence officer with the National Reconnaissance Office, the NRO.
Okay.
While he was working there, he was one of the people responsible for preparing and delivering the presidential daily intelligence briefings.
Oh,
That's not a job they give to just anybody
yeah.
because you have to be, capable of viewing all the same stuff that the
Right.
president does.
Yeah.
So, this is a guy who was trusted with secrets.
Yeah.
Uh, During that same time frame, from 2019 to 2021, he was the NRO representative to the UAP task force.
Okay.
For those of you who have gotten your timelines a little bit mixed up, and I don't blame you,
Yeah.
the UAP task force was the DOD's effort to put together its own UAP investigative body before Congress could tell it to do so. So it was kind of a 1-year thing. They were
Okay.
going to put out a report. They're like, look, we can do it. We don't need a law telling us we can do it. We've talked about the task force pretty recently, in fact, when we found out that Arrow, the current investigative body, doesn't have a bunch of the authorizations that you would
Right.
expect it to have. It has Title 10, but not Title 50, which means they can talk to military people and compel them to produce evidence, but they can't compel the intelligence community to produce evidence. And there's some weirdness around the guy that they've got leading it, whether he has the right credentials and access.
Right.
But none of those applied to the UAP task force. They had
Oh.
Title 10 and Title 50.
Oh,
The
interesting.
director had the proper credentials that you would expect. So knowing this guy was on the UAP task force is actually kind of a mark in his favor at the moment, because as far as we could tell, the UAP task force was actually set up to do the job before they
Interesting.
set up Arrow and maybe set it up to fail. So yeah, he was the NRO representative to the UAP task force until 2021. In 2021, he switched from the NRO to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the NGIA,
Okay.
where he was the co-lead for UAP analysis
Okay.
and the NGIA's representative to the UAP task force. So he switched orgs, but stayed in the UAP task force.
Okay. Got it.
During this time, he prepared UAP briefings for Congress, including on the retrieval of unexplained objects to the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee.
Okay.
The language there is a little weird. Retrieval of unexplained objects. I don't know if that means that he did a crash retrieval and reverse engineering briefing for Congress, or if that was a more general one before he kind of came out as a whistleblower.
Right.
So it's a little ambiguous what that means. But regardless, UAP briefings for Congress.
Okay.
He was also one of the people who was heavily involved in drafting the NDAA whistleblower protections, which were in the, I believe, the 2022 whistleblower NDAA, or maybe the 2023. But either way, like, he was doing all this stuff in 2021. We're going to talk about the timeline here a little bit. But basically, he's talking to Congress. He gets in a little bit of trouble for it. And then he works with Congress to craft whistleblower protection language.
That makes
sense. Which kind of confirms what we thought and what we've heard, which is Congress didn't just randomly decide, let's come up with whistleblower protection language on the topic of UAP.
Right.
That was in reaction to a particular event. We now have reason to believe what it's in reaction to is David Grusch.
Well, at least him, right? Like, it could have happened many times.
Yeah, at least him.
Yeah.
Totally. And then most recently, what's happened is he left the government in April of 2023 to advance government accountability through public awareness. So he's pulled a Lou Elizondo. He's like, I can't get this done within the government. I am leaving the government to help push this forward.
And I kind of wonder if he was like, if this was part of the retaliation complaint. Like, maybe after you've raised enough shit, like, you really can't get your job done anymore, so you kind of have to retire. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think that's a reasonable inference. Yeah. Excuse me. So yeah, let's talk about why he's credible, right? Because we talked about kind of in comparison to Bob Lazar. Bob Lazar has a lot of reasons to find him not a very credible witness. What makes this guy different, aside from the fact that, as we said, he's like testifying under oath?
Right. Yeah.
First of all, he has freaking impeccable credentials. Bob Lazar was like, I don't know, I went to like electrical college and I was hired by a guy in a parking lot and I went to this program nobody's ever heard of. Like, David Grusch has been around. He has a public track record. He was where he said he was. He was on these teams. He reported to the people he said he reported. All of this has been verified. So although there is a lot of debate about the claims that he is making, none of that debate centers around, is he lying to us about who he is? Like, he is clearly this guy. As a UAP task force investigator, he had sensitive compartmented information, SCI clearance, and access to over 2,000 special access programs.
Well, I have no idea if that's a lot or not.
I was just going to say, I don't know what that means. Those numbers were included in the article. Is that a lot? How many special access programs are there?
Yeah.
And on top of that, based on what we've heard from the Admiral Wilson documents, Admiral Wilson, on paper, was supposed to have access to every SCI.
In theory.
And he was denied access. So having access to over 2,000, I'm assuming what that means is having access to over 2,000, like, acknowledged programs.
Right.
Doesn't necessarily include the ones we're talking about. But regardless, this is not a guy who had, like, backdoor access to a couple of things.
Yeah.
Like, he was pretty far up the chain of command in terms of what they trusted.
Okay.
Before he came out and spoke to the debrief and did video interviews with Ross Coulthard. Oh, sorry, we didn't talk about that. The debrief article, by the way, simultaneously this week, he was also interviewed by Ross Coulthard, who's an Australian investigative journalist we really like. Ross has been publishing video. I say Ross, but News Nation is the network he's working with. They have been publishing snippets of the interview all week, and they are publishing an hour-long version of the interview tonight,
Ah,
actually, at 9 o'clock.
okay.
So this is one of those things where we're recording and we might get blown out of the water by whatever they say tonight,
All
but
right. Well,
it is what it is.
we'll record another one tomorrow, right?
Yeah. So this is a developing story, but basically Ross Coulthart is also heavily in here, along
Okay.
with Leslie and
Wow,
Rick.
that's a big cast.
But
Big names.
it really is. Yeah. So before he spoke to journalists, his claims, he did what he's supposed to do. So as an intelligence member, one of the things you're supposed to do before you do any public speaking,
Yeah.
like even before you write like a fiction
Right.
novel, you have to submit what you're going to say to the Defense Office Pre-Publication Security Review, DOPSR.
Hmm.
And all they're going to do is verify that what you're about to say is free of classified material and it doesn't breach national security.
Okay.
Um,
So they don't
so this
verify
is both.
truthfulness. Just this isn't
That
okay.
is a critical
Okay.
distinction. Yeah, exactly. We've actually heard about DOPSR a couple times. We haven't talked about it a lot on this program, but in the UFO world, this has come up a few times. There was a big book that came out last year called Skinwalkers at the Pentagon that talked about some of the Skinwalker Ranch stuff
Okay.
and post OSAP things. Um, that book notably went through DOPSR review, and they were like, "Oh, they cleared it. Everything in here has been approved by the Pentagon." Um,
Yeah.
we also heard about that from a guy that I thought we were going to be talking about today before all of this news
Yeah.
dropped, John Ramirez, who is a CIA officer. And one of the things he did is he heard about a lot of UFO stuff while he was there. And when he wanted to go talk about it publicly, he did what he's supposed to do. He put together a slide deck with everything he might ever want to talk about, and he submitted it for DOPSR, and they cleared it all. So he's like, I don't know if this stuff is true, but I can tell you they didn't tell me I can't talk about
Yeah.
it. They didn't like come out and squash it. They, anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's important to note that that doesn't mean it's truthful or
Right.
accurate. It just means it doesn't violate national
Okay.
security.
Yeah.
But yeah, he did what he was supposed to do.
Cool.
He submitted these claims for
Well,
review, and they were approved by the Pentagon.
that's cool. I mean that I feel like that's another point of legitimacy for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's not like a sure thing, but it definitely helps. The kind of pattern that we're building up to here is this is a credentialed guy who's going through all of the processes he is supposed to do. He is not thumbing his nose at his
Right.
NDAs. He is not ignoring what he's supposed to do. He is doing things by the book. He also has submitted a formal whistleblower complaint to the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community with his claims. We're going to talk about that, but the important thing to understand and why it makes him credible is everything he claimed there is under penalty of perjury. If it's found out that he's lying to the Inspector General, there are some pretty heavy duty consequences for that.
Yeah.
And last of all, he has multiple character witnesses. Just to list a few of them, Chris Mellon, our favorite UFO daddy, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intel, came out and said that he believes David Grusch. Lou Elizondo, former director of ATIP, who we've talked about a lot, gave a quote. He said, "Dave is an honorable man who served his country courageously, both during times of peace and war. He is who he says he is."
Okay.
As part of everything that was coming out, the debrief was able to get a hold of a 2022 performance review of David
Okay.
Grusch, where he was
Yeah.
described as an officer with the strongest possible moral compass.
Okay.
I wouldn't normally include it in there because that feels like a little weirdly braggy
Yeah.
kind of thing. But the reason I think it's notable is the timing. 2022 is right before he left. This is a very recent performance review, and it's notably while he's going through theoretically being retaliated against, the thing he
Yeah.
filed the investigator report about. So you would kind of expect that if he had been like, "Oh, here's a performance review from 1998," Like, okay, yeah, but how do they feel about you? Like, no, this is a recent thing.
Yeah.
They've been saying as of last year, this guy has a very strong moral compass. They may be regretting that now, but
Or, I mean, I feel like I want to strive for my next performance review to have that. Like, who writes that in their performance reviews? Like,
yeah,
uh, I mean, I can't tell if it's like he was being retaliated against by someone who was not his manager, and his manager was like trying to do a solid, being like, no, really, high moral compass. This is important. Use this.
yeah, yeah. We
Or
don't have any of the
what? Yeah.
context of why it was written, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um, Jim Shell. I've
Hmm.
never heard this name before today,
Yeah.
but he is a former chief scientist for the Air Force Space Command. This is the group
Okay.
of the Air Force that later became the Space Force. Um, he put up a LinkedIn post talking about Grusch's claims, said, I vouch for the integrity of Dave Grusch. And another name we've never heard before, but we'll be talking about today is Carl E. Neal. He
Hmm.
is a
Okay.
retired Army colonel and a current aerospace executive. The thing that's relevant to us is he worked with Dave Grusch on the UAP task force, where Carl
Mm.
Neal was the Army liaison to the
Okay.
task force. Um, and he calls him, quote, beyond reproach.
Hmm.
So again, unlike Lazar, where people are kind of coming out of the woodwork to talk
Right.
about, like, I don't like this guy, I find him sketchy. It seems like everyone we talk to who knows the guy is like, this dude's the real deal. He is
Hmm.
absolutely unflappable, unshakable. He does the right thing no matter what. So there are plenty of reasons to doubt what he says. We'll cover
Hmm.
that later, but I kind of wanted to go over and especially highlighting against Lazar. This dude isn't no one. He is coming out with a clear background, strong credentials, character witnesses. He's doing things the right way. There are reasons to doubt what he says, but those reasons are not he's doing the wrong thing or
Right.
he's skipped a step or it's more just the things he's claiming are so wild that you naturally need to pay more attention to it. But the obvious red flags are not there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I'm glad. At least we haven't heard him yet, right? Like it takes time to be
Yeah,
skeptical. Takes
no,
time to
totally.
debug.
All right. So this next section here, I want to talk about what he actually found. What are his actual claims? What are his
Okay.
actual claims? But before we get into that, I realized I glossed over a part that I wanted to talk about. So if you listened to last week's episode, we were talking about NASA coming out and saying like, oh, there's not really any evidence. We need more scientific research into it. A lot
Right.
of people kind of felt like it was a nothing burger. Um, we recorded that episode on Saturday. We edited and uploaded it on Sunday, and Chuck is about to take like a 3 or 4 week vacation, which is obviously going to impact our recording schedule. So Chuck and I were talking, and he's like, "Hey, man, how do we shift things around?" And he's like, "I think I can record an episode on the 11th, right before I leave, and then you can release that a little later, and then there'll only be a little gap." And we were like, "Yeah, yeah, that'll work." So like I said, I had an episode planned where we were going to talk about something that wasn't very like time sensitive. We were going to
Yeah.
talk about this John Ramirez guy from the CIA, and it would have been a great episode. We'll
Totally.
still do it, but
But this is too big.
instead, on Monday morning, I go for my walk. I look at my podcast, and I see Ross Coulthard dropped a new episode of his podcast with Bryce Sable, and they start talking about like, holy cow, big week, Roscoe. Like, yeah, this new article of the debrief dropped. Let's talk about it. And like, here's who, I got to interview this guy. I've been keeping this real close. I'm like, what is happening? I ran home and like pulled up this article on the debrief, and my jaw is dropping lower with every
Yeah.
paragraph for all these claims we're about to get into. And I'm texting Chuck like, holy shit, man, it's happening.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh my God. So like obviously this is what we're recording today, right?
Obviously.
Like, and
Yeah.
we're going to put this episode out early. So even though we aim for like an every other week cadence, we're putting this
Yeah.
episode out as soon as you're done editing it.
Yeah.
And I might be releasing some like quick
You
little
absolutely
episodes
should.
while Chuck's on vacation if stuff is continuing to develop where it's like, hey, Chuck's not here, but here's what I would be saying to him if he was.
I mean,
Like,
how else am I going to get my news?
oh my God. So yeah, you could not have picked a worse time to go on vacation than the week that disclosure apparently started.
I blame Grush, really. That's
Yeah. It was really inconsiderate of him
yeah,
not to
right?
check in with. We're a well-respected,
Yeah.
highly trafficked podcast.
Yeah.
Could have timed it a little better, buddy.
Sheesh. Come on.
Oh man. All right. So let's talk about what was going on in this article because
Yeah.
it was a jaw dropper. It was crazy. And now
Yeah.
you skimmed it over as well. Was there
Yeah.
anything in particular that stood out to you that you wanted to talk about?
I mean, the thing that I found hard to deal with is like it was all credentials all the time and like,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know, I feel like they sort of buried the lead. Um,
A
like,
little bit.
3 pages in, they talk about like what he's actually talking, like what he's brought up, and I'm like, okay, that's wild. But like, still, there's no details, and about what it is, so
Hmm.
I
There's a
still
little
am
more
leaving
detail
it.
in it than you think, but I completely
Okay,
agree that
maybe I
it was
missed it.
structured in a fairly confusing way, and it's
Yeah,
lengthy and it's full of quotes and
yeah,
acronyms and yeah, I had to read it a few times, but yeah, there are some jaw-dropping bits in it. So, in a nutshell, we've covered he is a respected guy,
yeah,
and while he's working on the UAP task force, he says he was approached by members of these UAP programs with concerns. So it's notable that Grush was not
plural.
like a UFO believer before. He wasn't like the guy who's out there
Mm,
like, we got to get to the bottom of this. He
right.
he ends up on the task force. He is very well respected. And people start coming to him because he's so well respected.
Okay,
They're like, yo,
interesting.
what's going on is kind of fucked up.
Okay,
So this is a quote from Grush. He says, individuals on these UAP programs approached me in my official capacity and disclosed their concerns regarding a multitude of wrongdoings, such as illegal contracting against the federal acquisition regulations and other criminality, and the suppression of information across a qualified industrial base and academia.
hmm.
Now, that is the
Yeah,
most wordy way of saying it, but this boils down to two things we've talked about before. One, um, the illegal contracting bit, that's
yeah,
got to do with the federal government has very particular rules they're supposed to handle when they give out contracts. One of
yeah,
them is allowing people to bid on them. You
right,
really are supposed to avoid the implication that the federal government has a favored contractor.
right, yeah,
Um,
which makes sense.
well, the word here is basically they picked one of those
Hmm,
federal contractors, probably Lockheed, and just gave them stuff because it was so sensitive that they couldn't open it up for bidding.
right, yeah,
But if you're one of Lockheed's competitors, that's
right,
that's concerning. Um, so that's one part of it. Another part is the idea that this is information that they're learning about how these craft work and stuff that could be life changing.
sure,
Dr. Stephen Greer has been beating this drum for years, and while I don't agree with everything he says, I agree with one particular part, which is we are facing a number of technological problems in our world, not least of which is climate change caused by our reliance on fossil fuels. If it comes out that they had access to other forms of energy, things that could have addressed this, and they didn't share it with it, that's really concerning as we're dealing with like the
yeah,
day-to-day realities of climate change.
yeah, right,
So yeah, he says he's got people coming to him with concerns.
sure,
So he reports to Congress on the existence of a decades long publicly unknown Cold War for recovered and exploited physical material, a
Hmm.
competition with near-peer adversaries over the years to identify UAP crashes and landings and retrieve the material for exploitation and reverse engineering to garner asymmetric national defense advantages.
Okay.
Basically, if you're the first nation to crack a flying saucer,
Right.
it's game
You
over for
win.
everyone
Yeah.
else,
Yeah.
right? It is a huge advantage.
I agree with
They
that.
are strongly implying here something we've been hearing for years, which is the idea that Russia and China also have crash retrieval programs. And the reason the Air Force have been so aggressive about allegedly going into other countries and taking things from there, the Virginia incident, which we still haven't talked about, but is a big story,
Okay.
kind of ends with there was this UFO crash and there are alien bodies and the Brazilian authorities are dealing with this and the Air Force shows up and puts it all in boxes and takes it away. That was the last anybody saw of it. Like,
Huh.
who authorized that? Did they show up at gunpoint? Was there an agreement with the
Right.
Brazilian government? Like, it's unclear.
Huh.
So Grusch says that the US government and defense contractors have been recovering fragments of non-human craft, and in some cases, entire craft, for decades. He says we are not talking about prosaic origins or identities. The material includes intact and partially intact vehicles.
Hmm.
Analysis has determined that the material is of exotic origin, meaning, quote, non-human intelligence, whether extraterrestrial or unknown origin.
Yeah.
That's the big one.
Wow.
You and I have talked about this a lot. There's politicians and military people who are willing to talk about it, but kind of the safe way to talk about it without jeopardizing your career is you don't say the word alien.
Sure. Yeah.
There are UAPs, there are unexplained anomalous phenomena in our skies, and we're looking at them because they're there and we don't know
Yeah.
what they are, and they're a flight safety risk. That's been
Right.
the thing
Yeah.
that everyone hammers
That's
on. That's
safe.
why Christian Gillibrand and Marco Rubio can come out and talk about this and still run for president without getting laughed off stage, is
Right.
because they are couching it in the language of being concerned for our troops.
Yeah. Sure.
The obvious next question is, okay, well, who's flying them? They are very careful not to explore that question,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So here's David Grusch being very blunt about it. Yes,
Yeah.
crash retrievals, reverse engineering, and non-human intelligence,
Hmm.
which seems obvious, but it's a big deal that people are
Yeah.
stating it. He has
Yeah.
moved
Right.
the conversation forward, dragging people kicking and screaming into, sorry, we're going to talk about this on the terms that it needs to be talked about. No more couching it in ambiguous, oh, it's flight safety. It might be
Yeah.
balloons. I don't care. We just need to find out what it is. Dude,
Right.
no, we're going to talk about the fact that we've got crashed alien saucers. Like, yeah, so I know I'm hammering this a little hard,
Yeah.
but I can't state what a big deal it is to see someone with credentials come out and
Yeah. Okay.
meaningfully shift the conversation in a week to this is a serious topic of conversation. Whether people believe it or not, they are talking about it.
So, like, I sent this article to a buddy, and the problem was it didn't shift him in any way.
Right.
Um, and I don't know, maybe you've got that planned out for discussion, but I'm not sure if it did shift the discussion.
I don't think it's done yet. is
Okay.
is where I'm going with it.
Sure.
I
Okay.
think it
That makes
has
sense.
shifted the discussion a bit. We will talk about how.
Okay.
But I think this is the start. You're
Okay.
looking at day one of a
Okay.
process, is
Of
why I
course, it
say.
hasn't changed everything yet. Okay. Fair point.
Yeah, I'm not all that excited about the debrief article in particular. And we'll talk about there are some legitimate points to be concerned and raise your eyebrows at in this article.
Okay.
But I don't see us going backwards from here. The only
Mm,
thing I could see that puts the genie back in the bottle here is if they come out and they manage to meaningfully debunk what Grush is saying. And I don't see that happening. So anyway, we'll get into it.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
the debrief article, they've got a quote in there that I want to highlight. They said, in his statements that were cleared for publication by the Pentagon in April, Grusch asserted that UFO legacy programs have long been concealed within multiple agencies, nesting UAP activities in conventional secret access programs without reporting to various oversight authorities. Now, that is very dry language, but it is worth hammering on because that's the Admiral Wilson memo in a nutshell. That is exactly what Admiral Wilson was talking about. He's like, hey, the the claim here is that this stuff has been around since the 40s and they've been playing a shell game
Mm,
within the legitimate reporting apparatus where they are not even using the most secret of secret programs. They are taking another step beyond. These are true black programs. They are illegally funded, they're hidden from oversight, and they appear to be nested in private industry as a means of evasion.
hmm.
Grusch
Okay.
is talking about all the same things that
Yeah.
Admiral Wilson talks about. So it's not proof that Admiral Wilson document is real, but it is the the same claim that we are hearing from other sources, and it makes sense to me. This is
Yeah.
increasingly the picture that we are getting developed of this is
Right.
some shit went down in the 40s, and regardless of whether you think it has continued to happen or not, there has been an ongoing maneuver by some parties to conceal this from the public, from Congress, from the president, from oversight
Right.
in ways that are illegal. And Grush goes on to make other claims that we're not really going to touch on here because they're barely touched on in the debrief article, but I expect we will be talking about them when Ross Coulthart's interviews drop.
Okay.
He has been very clear this has been an illegal cover up that has included disinformation campaigns
Mm,
against Congress and against the American public. Um, it
okay.
is strongly
Makes sense.
implied that he has said that the government has killed people over this secret.
Wow.
So, yeah,
Okay. So we're, yeah.
we're
Okay.
kind of talking about the driest possible side of this, right? Like appropriations and
Yeah. Right.
reporting structures. But
That's,
I believe Ross Coulthart is going to take this narrative further into like the natural implications once you get beyond there is a secret program. Well, what do you do to cover up a secret program?
right.
And the claim here is that they have gone too far.
Okay. Yeah.
Um,
So I see that you were talking about the like the acceptable way to talk about this was to not mention aliens, and the acceptable way. So the shift here is like, no, we're going to involve the aliens, but I'm still going to make lodge this as
yeah,
an official complaint because that's the
yeah,
way
yeah,
we talk about things. And maybe the next shift is no,
yeah. Mhm.
we're talking about those people you murdered because of aliens.
Leslie Kane said something really interesting a few years ago when I listened to an interview with her talking about the 2017 story. And she said, the reason that she was able to get that story in front of the right people and get the New York Times to take the topic of UFOs seriously at all is she said that story wasn't about UFOs.
Mm,
That story was about a political scandal. The government has spent millions of dollars on something they have said for years is bullshit and not worth looking at.
hmm,
That's that's newsworthy. That's worth
yeah,
talking about. Whatever you think about UFOs, the fact that there was a secret program with a
yeah,
multiple $1 million budget is worth discussing. So
yeah, yeah. That
I
makes sense.
I think it makes sense that when Leslie Kane comes into this, she still kind of tries to hook it onto something that people can wrap their head around. Because I was saying to someone the other day, like I have been the advocate for this on this podcast. I've been the nerd who's like, this shit's all real, Chuck, and waiting for you to kind of pull me back a little bit. But I'll be perfectly honest with you. I'm a little more agnostic on it than I think I come across. If you were to
Interesting.
pin me down and ask me if I believe it, the answer is yes. But I haven't spent a lot of time diving into like what does that mean? Because
Hmm.
the instant you crack that door to there are aliens and they're here and have been
Now
here
what?
and the
Yeah.
government knows about it, my God, there's it's like a crack in the dam. That was
Yeah.
a really inappropriate timed metaphor. I apologize. But you know what I mean? Like it
Yeah.
is an absolute overwhelming amount of follow-up questions that come out. The
Yeah.
instant you get that one fact,
Mm.
non-human intelligence, the whole
Everything.
world
Interesting.
is up for question. So
Yeah.
even as a believer on this topic, I haven't interrogated it. So I don't blame Leslie Kane for framing this around kind of like, hey, we're going to talk about the political intrigue aspect of this.
Yeah.
Like that's the approachable part. I get it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It makes sense because I think that's why my buddy didn't like pick up. Like
Mhm.
I can't, and I think that's why a lot of people don't pick this up or accept it. It's
Right.
just it's too fucking big.
It's too fucking big and it's still not in the big papers.
Yeah.
So a natural question, which we'll
Mm.
talk about later, is like, well, how do I feel about this? It's on this website I've never heard of. Like, okay. Anyway,
Hmm.
Ross Coulthart, who, as always, does a great job of kind of summarizing the parts you should care about, says he has given to Congress, allegedly, the locations of where these craft are stored, the names of the people in charge of the program, the gatekeepers controlling access to that program, both from within the Pentagon and apparently a private aerospace company. That is another part that I think is really important to hone in on,
Yeah.
right? He said all of this under oath and he named names. He
Yeah.
gave locations. He's not
Right.
just saying there's a program. He's saying the UFOs are in building X in
Yeah.
facility Y. The guy in charge of the program is this dude. The
Yeah.
person who's preventing you from getting access is this guy. That's the information that Congress needs
Yeah. That
to
they can
take
actually
the next
follow.
step.
Yeah. Right.
Exactly. So it gets beyond just he's making claims into he's making verifiable claims. And he's basically daring Congress to do something about it. Like,
Right.
okay, here you go on a silver platter. This is
Right.
where it is. Go kick
Yeah.
in some doors.
Because he probably doesn't have the authority or never did to
Right.
like ask that kind of question.
Hmm.
Or maybe he did, but yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm about to read a really good quote from the debrief. And there is a detail nested in this quote that I didn't notice until the third time I read it that completely amplifies what it's saying.
Okay.
Uh, Associates who vouched for Grusch said his information was highly sensitive, providing evidence that materials from objects of non human origin are in the possession of highly secret black programs. Although locations, program names, and other specific data remain classified, the Inspector General and Intelligence Committee staff were provided with these details. Several current members of the recovery program spoke to the Inspector General's office and corroborated the information Grusch had provided for the classified complaint.
Hmm.
Now, I read that the first few times. I'm like, okay, yeah, people backed up what he was saying, right? They got other people who said, yeah, I know this guy. He's telling the truth. They're kind of rehammering the idea that these things are from non-human origins. I did not notice that what this actually says is several current members
Yeah.
of the recovery program spoke to the inspector general's office and corroborated it. They're
Yeah.
not just saying like Lou Elizondo came out here and said, yeah, Grusch is right. I found the same thing. They're not talking to Admiral Wilson. They're talking to the guys working in the UFO program, and they're saying,
Right.
yes, it's real. I work here now.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That is interesting.
What?
Yeah.
That's ah.
Well, and like, so, who was it Chris Mellon who's J2? Who was it that couldn't get access to the programs even
That
after
was Admiral Wilson.
that was
Yeah.
Admiral Wilson? Okay. So, like, why is the Office of the Inspector General suddenly able to like talk to these people when Admiral Wilson wasn't? That
I'm
that's
not sure
interesting.
they were able to. I think they came forward. The
Ah,
implication here is
okay,
David Grusch named names, and the inspector general called those people and
right.
asked questions, and they said yes because in that context they're allowed to. I I don't know, man. It's wild. Now we're reading into things,
Yeah,
but
sure.
I really wanted to hammer that one sentence.
Yeah, that
The
is
people corroborating him are not just randos in the military,
yeah,
people he knows, friends of his, or other people who are kind of on the UFO bandwagon like Lou Elizondo. I love Lou, but if Lou comes out and says this guy's telling the truth, well, I'm not surprised. Lou's already told us this stuff. So hearing Lou confirm it is like, well, yeah, of course Lou's going to confirm it.
yeah.
Hearing current members of the program testified to the inspector general that this is real. Holy cow, that's a big deal.
Huh.
Um, and then I've got a couple other quotes here from associates. So Carl Nell,
Okay.
we talked about him earlier. He was
Yeah.
Grush's peer on the UAP task force. He was the Army liaison to the UAP task force while Grush was there. Carl Nell said, his assertion concerning the existence of a terrestrial arms race occurring sub rosa over the past 80 years, focused on reverse engineering technologies of unknown origin, is fundamentally correct, as is the indisputable realization that at least some of these technologies of unknown origin derive from non human intelligence. Right?
Yeah.
Again,
It's
he's
like
not just coming out and saying, yeah, there are UFOs. Yeah, there's a
right.
secret program, might be Russian. No, he's again saying what he's saying is right. There has been an arms race, and it's for non-human intelligence. They are hammering that NHI line. And I think that line, that phrase is going to be more and more relevant in the coming days. This is representing a step away from, I don't know, like it could be Russian, it could be
Yeah.
ours. We don't think it is, but and kind of dancing around the idea of, well, if it's not ours and it's not Russian and it's not Chinese,
Right.
whose is it?
Who is
No,
it?
they're just straight up saying it now. This is non-human tech.
Right. Huh. Yeah. So I don't know that I buy the uh, indisputable realization, um, but but I do agree that
I think he's saying it's indisputable given the evidence he has seen, not that
okay.
for the casual listener of this sentence, it
Yeah.
is indisputable.
Fair point.
All right. So the last kind of quote I want to read here before we get into like what happened as a result of this um, is from a guy named Jonathan Gray, who the article points out is speaking publicly for the first time. He is an intel community officer for the National Air and Space Intel Center, NASIC. Um, One really weird part about this article is they note that he is identified here under the identity he uses inside the agency.
Hmm.
So Jonathan Gray is an alias, but it's the alias he uses at work.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a normal thing in the intelligence community.
Super weird, right? And of course, the Twitter crowd is having great fun with
I'm sure.
you know unsourced, not unsourced, but quotes supporting David Grush from a guy named Gray.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, he has a great series of quotes here. He says, first of all, the existence of complex historical programs involving the coordinated, oh, excuse me, Jesus. Can you make a timestamp note and edit that out, please?
Gotcha.
All right, take two. He says, the existence of complex historical programs involving the coordinated retrieval and study of exotic materials dating back to the early 20th century should no longer remain a secret, he said. The majority of retrieved foreign exotic materials have a prosaic terrestrial explanation and origin, but not all, and any number higher than 0 in this category represents an undeniably significant statistical percentage. Basically, if we're finding material and they're made of elements that don't occur on Earth, it doesn't matter that 99% of the elements we recover are explainable. That 1% is really fucking weird. We can't ignore it. A vast array of our most sophisticated sensors, including space-based platforms, have been utilized by different agencies, typically in triplicate, to observe and accurately identify the out-of-this-world nature, performance, and design of these anomalous machines, which are then determined not to be of an earthly origin. So satellites are tracking UFOs and they're making impossible maneuvers.
Right.
Again, something we've heard, but we're now getting confirmed from an insider. And not just observed by one or two, but these space-based telescopes are shared by multiple agencies. He goes out of his way to say typically in triplicate. So we would expect multiple intelligence agencies to both know about this and have satellite intel.
Yeah, maybe we don't need Galileo, Project Galileo.
Right. And this last one is great. He says, although it is a tough nut to crack, potential technological advancements may be gleaned from non-human intelligence or UAP retrievals by any sufficiently advanced nation, and then used to wage asymmetrical warfare. So therefore, some secrecy must remain. However, it is no longer necessary to continue to deny that these advanced technologies derived from non-human intelligence, that they exist at all, or to deny that these technologies have landed, crashed, or fallen into the hands of human beings.
Yeah.
And this is something I've heard. Yeah, go ahead.
That totally makes sense. Yeah. Like, we can say we have it. Everyone else knows it. It's like saying we have nukes. Yeah, everyone knows that too.
Right?
Doesn't change the equation.
Yeah, totally. I think nukes are the perfect example, right? Like the production of nuclear weapons is a closely guarded secret. The existence of them is not. And I think we are probably, if we talk about most likely outcomes from this, I don't think it's going to be, Tesla starts selling personal UFOs. Like whatever the advanced reactors are that power them, anti-gravity, stuff like that, I think is still going to be extremely classified, top secret stuff. But the knowledge that it comes from interaction with the non-human intelligence should not be a secret.
Yeah.
And if there are technologies that come out of this that could benefit the public in a safe way, they should be. And there are, if you accept that there are non-human intelligence and they've been reverse engineering it, it is hard to imagine a world in which they have learned nothing that could benefit the public. It's easy for me to imagine that they have made breakthroughs, but there is no way to release them to the public without divulging the secret. Well, if the secret is that non-human intelligence exists and we get that secret out of the way, then suddenly we can say, hey, here is a new power system that we can deploy at certain power plants that we reverse engineered from non-human intelligence. That is safe to say. So we're hearing this increasingly. This was the nut of Chris Mellon's article last week talking about, like, hey, if the government has non-human technology, now's the time to release it.
Yeah.
And can we talk for a minute, by the way, about the timing of Chris Mellon's article?
It's like he knew some things were coming down the pipe.
I suspect he did. Avi Loeb puts out his article talking about stuff. Chris Mellon puts out his article. Stephen Greer is holding a disclosure conference this week, like right now, this weekend. Like, I have a feeling that the news that this was coming was known to a few more people than we think, and some people knew it was coming at least in the general sense, and we're able to start laying the groundwork. It is
Yeah.
also quite clear now that when Eric Davis a couple of weeks ago said there was a whistleblower who recently testified in Congress and it stirred up quite a hornet's nest, he's
Right.
obviously referring to this.
Yeah.
Like, good Lord,
Yeah. That makes total sense. I feel
right?
like I read somewhere that the reason they went with debrief instead of New York Times or Washington Post was that those two weren't able to get it done in time. But that never made any sense to me. Like in time for
Hmm.
what? Um,
We'll talk about
yeah.
that later. There's some information around that, which I think is really valuable and helps
Okay.
address the skepticism around why this wasn't a New York Times cover
Yeah.
story.
Right. Yeah.
So let's talk about the next part of this.
Okay.
Um, how did this work out for him? Because what we've talked about so far is here's who this guy is, here's why he's credible, and
Hmm.
here's what he is claiming he has learned. But as you and I talked about earlier, the way that this information has been shared was through a complaint, a whistleblower
Yeah.
complaint to the Inspector General of the intelligence community. Um, so the short answer of how did this work out for him is not great, apparently.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense.
So um, he is or was represented by a guy named Charles McCullough III, who, interestingly, was the original Inspector General of the intelligence community appointed
Oh,
back in 2011, who's the
that's
first
funny.
person to hold that role.
Yeah.
So interesting. But in May of 2022, McCullough filed a disclosure of urgent concerns complaint of reprisal with the ICIG. They've got a quote from the debrief here. Uh, Says an unclassified version of the complaint provided to us states that Grusch has direct knowledge that UAP related classified material information has been withheld and or concealed from Congress by elements of the intelligence community, quote, to purposely and intentionally thwart legitimate congressional oversight of the UAP program.
Hmm.
All testimony Grusch provided for the classified complaint was provided under oath. This gets us back to what you were talking about this being a political scandal, not a UFO
Yeah.
story. Grusch finds out that that information was illegally withheld from Congress. He starts going to Congress and through the proper channels to share it and is retaliated against. And he files a complaint saying,
Yeah.
here's what I know. And it blew up in my face.
Totally makes sense.
The complaint says that in July of 2021, Grusch confidentially gave classified info to the DoD Inspector General on the withholding of UAP information from Congress. So he does not start by going to Congress. He starts by going through proper channels. He finds out in the course of his job they're breaking the law. They're not telling Congress what they're supposed to tell. And he goes to the DoD Inspector General and he says, yo, this is fucked up. And, files a report,
Yeah.
says this shouldn't be happening. What happened, and the meat of his complaint is, he says the fact that he went to the Inspector General was shared outside the IG office and that he suffered months of retaliation and reprisal. The
Mm.
debrief article is very careful to note that he did not share details of what those reprisals were because this is an ongoing investigation.
Yeah.
Um, but basically, the Investigator General's office shared this information with people, and it's unclear whether this was as a result of sloppiness, they just weren't guarding it carefully,
Right.
whether it was deliberate, intended to harm him, or whether no one in the Inspector General's office did it. It was someone outside the chain of command who illegally accessed the information. But one way
Mm.
or another, it got out when it was
Right.
very clearly not supposed to. This is where he was being a whistleblower,
Right.
not going to Congress, going to the
Interesting.
DoDIG.
Okay.
And he was retaliated against for whistleblowing within the proper chain of command.
Right.
So the whistleblower complaint is filed with the intelligence community inspector general. and I apologize, I have no idea what the relationship between the DoD Inspector General
Yeah,
and the intelligence community Inspector General is, but he reports to the DoD,
yeah.
it leaks, and he is retaliated against. He files a whistleblower complaint with the intelligence community, IG.
Oh, interesting.
The ICIG found his complaint, quote, credible and urgent,
Hmm.
and a summary of the complaint was submitted to the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, and to both the House and Senate Select Committees on Intelligence. That complaint, which they saw the unclassified version of, includes the claims that he's making
Sure.
that this program exists and was illegally concealed from congressional oversight. So this is how this stuff is coming out. It's not that Grusch went to the press and said, "You got to learn what I know."
Yeah.
He tried to do the right thing by going to the DoD. It blew up in his face. He filed a complaint with the ICIG, and that complaint has been shared with Congress. And now he has retired from government. And I think you probably hit the nail on the head when you said maybe he just wasn't able to work in government anymore, rightly or wrongly. And now he is going public. And even there, he didn't go rogue.
Yeah.
He took his remarks to the proper
Yeah.
process,
The
DOPSR,
Dopser and yeah.
got them reviewed, and is now talking publicly. So I find that was a complicated bit of political theater and back and forth
Yeah.
and how does complaints work, but it gives me more confidence, right? This is not a Bob Lazar guy who's coming forward because he thinks they're maybe going to kill him and he hasn't done any of the right things. This is a guy who tried repeatedly to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And even now, even when it blew up in his face and they did not protect him, he kept doing the right thing. He worked with Congress to craft whistleblower protection language for other people moving forward. He has
Right.
come forward and is still following the right release process for information.
Is the complaint that went to Congress, is that about the hidden programs or is it about retaliation?
Yeah,
Okay.
it is about him being retaliated against for testifying to the DoD IG about those programs.
Right. Okay. So Congress might learn things that they need to continue uh, that fight, but the actual complaint is about the retaliation, and it just
Mhm.
happens to contain info that Congress might use to further investigate. Um,
Well, he's now going public, but yes, the way it came to Congress originally was through proper back channels.
hmm,
Um,
that's
Not
interesting.
back channels. That's sneaking around through front channels.
Front channels, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Um, okay,
Okay.
it's just it. Yeah, but it's an interesting distinction because it puts a color on some of the like discussion that
Hmm.
like if the complaint was about hidden programs, um, then that like has to be addressed head on. But if the
Hmm.
complaint is about retaliation, they can kind of conveniently skip all the other stuff if they want to. And we might need
Well, it's
another
also
complainer.
noteworthy that Congress doesn't have to do anything about this. They
Sure.
were notified, but what Congress does next is an open question. And we'll talk about this a little bit
Okay.
coming up. But let's shift gears here for a moment
Okay.
because I've been leaning hard on here's why I find this guy credible. Here's why I think this rings true for me. But I said before, there are some legitimate red flags here that people have been raising. Now, personally, I think there is a good answer for each of these. But in the interest of being fair, I want to raise each of these.
Sure.
Um, so the first one you already talked about. This is a big story. Why isn't it in the New York Times?
Right.
Leslie and Ralph are New York Times reporters or have been in the past. Why isn't New York Times writing this? Why isn't the Washington Post? The Debrief, while I like them a lot, are an aggressively independent organization that was founded
Okay.
specifically to talk about military and UFO issues, right? Like
Okay.
the UFO story got published in the UFO newspaper. Like
Big
that's not
surprise.
surprising.
Yeah.
Um, So again, the way I heard about this first was listening to Ross's podcast. So I had no context for the story at this point. And Ross has a whole section in the podcast, which, by the way, if you've never listened to his podcast, highly, highly recommend it. He is
Okay.
eminently listenable. Um,
Awesome.
but he goes on a great rant um, that boils down to him saying that he is livid that mainstream media passed on this story.
Yeah.
He's like, he calls them gutless cowards. And he is very clear. He's like, look, this story is going to prove bigger than Watergate and Iran-Contra.
Hmm.
Those are big claims. And it's worth
Yeah.
remembering that Ross himself has several upcoming pieces about to be released on this topic. He's not
Right.
exactly unbiased, but I will say, once again, Ross Coulthard has earned a great deal of credit
Yeah.
with me over the years. He has shown a pretty measured approach to this. Um, I really do think it's notable that he came in as not a skeptic, but expecting there was nothing to it. He gave a
Yeah.
quote years ago, said he was going to write a UFO book, and he figured he would look into it for a couple of weeks, crack the whole thing wide open, and put out a book showing that it was nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
That always sounds right.
yeah. So anyway, Ross is livid. They're gutless cowards. Um, the community is kind of freaking out about it. Why not the New York Times? And the only thing
Right.
we're hearing is they passed on it, maybe due to time pressure, or due to pressure. But where's the pressure coming from? Like I'm seeing these
Hmm.
comments everywhere. Can someone please explain what pressure they were under? So Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Kane both put out a statement on their Twitters. They put out the identical statement. Um, Said the Washington Post did not pass on our UAP story. Ralph and I took it to the debrief because we were under growing pressure to publish it very quickly. The Post needed more time, and we couldn't wait. Um, so I think that was really cool. They
No.
came out and like took some of the community heat off of them. Like, hey, this wasn't their fault. We made the decision.
Right.
Notably, they did not mention the New York Times.
Yeah. Who probably
Later,
did pass.
yeah. So later, Leslie and Ralph gave an interview talking about it, and some more details came out. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to be clear, I might get a couple details wrong here because I have not actually watched the video interview they gave because
Hmm.
I was at a
Okay.
funeral this week and like I've just been trying to keep up. But
Yeah.
the gist of it is the New York Times did pass on this story, but they passed based on an early version of the story back in April. Um,
Wow.
Leslie and Ralph have talked repeatedly about the New York Times and about getting work published in the New York Times. And the impression I have gotten is that back in 2017, there was one editor in particular at the Times who they had a good relationship with and was at least somewhat open to the topic. They were able to get several articles published in a row. They have not published anything at the New York Times on this topic in something like 4 years.
Hmm.
And as I understand it, there has been a pretty big editorial shakeup at the Times. Sorry, that made it sound more dramatic than it is. It's been 4 years, right? People come and go.
Yeah.
There is a new editor in chief. The editor they were working with is no longer there. So it's just harder to get a foot in the door at all.
Right.
And the impression I get is the new guy is not particularly open to becoming the UFO paper of record.
Right.
So they brought it to New York Times. They passed. They went to the Washington Post, who was interested, but said they needed more time to do further reporting and to get congressional reactions.
Mm.
And Leslie and Ralph walked. So they ended up at the debrief because the debrief was able to match the timeline they had.
Yeah.
Now, Blumenthal gave a quote. He said that circumstances, including that Grusch's identity as the whistleblower had leaked onto the internet, pushed them to publish sooner than we had hoped. He said, if there had been no leaks, it might have been different. But people on the internet were spreading stories. Dave was getting harassing phone calls, and we felt the only way to protect
Hmm.
him was to get the story out. When the pair realized that the Post just needed more time and there was no clear sense of when we might finish that process, They took the story to the Debrief, an outlet that had published the two of them before and was willing and able to move quickly.
Interesting.
Um, I find that completely believable.
Yeah.
Um, since then, we've heard rumors that the New York Times is working on their own story. The rumor was it's supposed to drop today. Who knows? Maybe
Okay.
it's dropped right now and we're missing it. But
Ah,
so there may still be a New York Times article on it, or there may not be. The Washington Post is almost certainly working on their own story, and we have seen the story get picked up by other serious um, newspapers, perhaps most notably The Hill, which specializes
oh,
in political reporting about
yeah.
Congress. If you are interested in this topic, in addition to reading the original article, on the Debrief, they have a 3-part series of articles talking specifically about the fact-checking process for
Hmm.
publishing this article. They
Okay.
are well aware that they are under high level of scrutiny. There is a perception that as the UFO paper, maybe they didn't do their due diligence. So they really basically go through the article line by line, talking about the claims it makes, talking about what their process is.
Huh.
If you're into this stuff, it is totally worth reading. But the short version of it is they did not publish this lightly. They
Yeah.
absolutely did the work they needed to do. Um, but yeah, there is apparently some pressure around Grusch's identity leaking. Ironically, this confirms a rumor that I did not share with you in the news section on an
Yeah.
earlier episode, but thought about, which was attorney Daniel Sheehan, who is a guy we've talked a little bit about. He has this really kind of shocking white head of curly hair. He's a very,
Okay.
very notable guy. Um, he is Lou Elizondo's lawyer, among other places. Um, he apparently said in an interview a couple of weeks ago that the Washington Post was going to publish a big story, and he gave a date, and he named some names of witnesses that were going to be in that article. And then it didn't publish, and the community was like, first of all, their immediate reaction was, "See, it's all bullshit. They were just
Mm.
making it up." And everybody else was like, "No, the the article got pulled because Sheehan gave their names, and now these people are like spooked." So I don't know for sure that that's what
Mm.
happened, but the correlation seems pretty clear to me that Danny got a little overexcited, said a name he shouldn't have, and it ended up lighting a fire under Ralph and Leslie, who were like, "Holy fuck, we've got to protect our witness."
Yeah.
Um, Ross Coulthart has been very clear that he was asked by Dave Grusch not to publish the video interviews until after the print article came out. So the timing there was driven by Dave. The
Okay.
timing on the print article was driven by a fear of leaks, which pushed them to the Debrief because the big
Okay.
papers insisted on needing more time.
Interesting. And it sounds like the time wasn't being spent on like verification. It was being spent on like waiting for other sources to come in and making it a bigger article, which
Yeah,
seems like that could take
I don't
forever.
want to totally, and I don't want to cast aspersions or make it sound like the Washington Post's process is wrong. I
No.
have no idea what they needed to do. They're a big paper. They have
Yeah.
serious things. Leslie and Ralph have talked before about the challenges of working with the New York Times, who have an
Yeah.
extremely strict fact checking and editorial process.
Yeah.
One of the things they said is New York Times will not let you use unnamed sources.
Mm.
That's just not a thing they do, which makes reporting on UAP stuff very tricky because how do you get
Yeah.
people to go on the record? Um,
Yeah. Interesting.
yeah. So anyway, that is one of the big questions people are asking. Why the Debrief? Why is it
Yeah.
on this weird third-party website?
Yeah.
I
Seems
agree,
like
it's
good
weird.
reasons.
I think they've given a plausible reason why, and fingers crossed the story gets picked up by a couple of the big papers and we can
Yeah.
put this concern to bed.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll stamp it plausible, like in Mythbusters.
Mhm. So another common complaint is Grusch has presented no actual evidence. And in fact, Grusch has
Hmm.
been very clear. He never saw a UFO. He never saw a body. He hasn't been to any of these warehouses. He is only sharing the things he learned from interviewing other witnesses in the
Got it.
UAP task force. But of course, if you're skeptical about the whole thing, well, that's a red flag. Like, oh,
Hmm.
this is all third-hand information. Like, maybe he was misled. Um, so the first thing to note is he has presented no evidence publicly. He says that the evidence he has is almost entirely classified, and he
Sure.
has only shared it in appropriate venues. And one of the examples the debrief gives is he has been talking to congressional committees. Apparently, one of the things that happens in Congress, if you're worried that it might blow back on you that you attended a particular committee meeting,
Mm.
is you send your staffers instead of yourself,
Okay.
which for most stuff is fine. But in this case, uh, those staffers certainly do not have secure compartmentalized information access. That's not a thing they're going to have. So he was not able to share some of the evidence he has with Congress in those forums. But he has been
Okay.
very clear. Everything he knows has been shared with the Inspector General and through proper channels. So it's all out there to the people who have clearances and accesses, but it has not been shared with the public or with portions of Congress,
Right.
which does nicely help forestall when Congress people start coming out and saying, I've never heard of Dave Grusch. I don't know if what he's saying is accurate. And everybody's like, well, if he testified, wouldn't they be like, yeah, it's true? Well, first of all, not all of them attend the meetings. And second of
Sure.
all, some of the meetings, apparently they weren't able to share information. So anyway,
Yeah.
um, the last thing I'll say on sorry, also we talked about this briefly before. He shared all of his evidence with the inspector general. Um, if he's lying to them, that carries serious consequences
Mm.
because
Hmm.
he's under penalty of perjury. So
Yeah.
that's another thing we're like, okay, yeah, he hasn't shared the evidence with us, but where he did share it, there are very real consequences for fucking it up.
Yeah.
Um, I would also like to share a great quote here from Ross Coulthart. Um,
Okay.
he, of course, has been touring around to the news stations talking about it and
Yeah.
promoting his own piece. And one of the anchors asked him, like, Dave Grusch hasn't actually presented any evidence. And Ross kind of sighs. He goes, there's a funny double standard here. During the last Gulf War, I was being briefed by members of our intelligence community that we should accept the word of sources who were telling us that there were weapons of mass destruction in the Iraqi desert and that Saddam Hussein was making a nuclear bomb or chemical weapons. Well, it turned out there were no weapons of mass destruction, so the media were quite happy to accept at the time assurances of unnamed intelligence sources. Well, here we have an on record official who, until a few weeks ago, was a very senior officer in the US military, very, very high level, handling the most sensitive of intelligence. He has sworn an oath to tell the truth. He is prepared to go to jail if it can be shown that he's told a lie. All he wants is for them to call his bluff and take him up on properly investigating if what he says is true. So I think it's a bit rich for people to make the claim that there's an issue with the fact that he can't provide this evidence. He has been very upfront about that. He said he's not legally allowed to reveal the evidence that could validate what he's saying. Documents, reports, photographs that he has been allowed to see because of his security classification. Because you and I don't have a top secret clearance, we're not allowed to see it. But he is saying the committees in Congress that do have those classifications should now ask for that information, should call those witnesses and convince themselves whether or not he's telling the truth.
Hmm.
Now, when he first started talking about this, I thought it was just going to be a little bit of sour grapes. Like, oh, you guys believed everything about the Iraq war, but now you won't believe my guy. But I think he makes a really good point here. Like, okay, yeah, I can't share this with the public, but I told Congress about it. I gave them the names, the locations, the dates, the buildings, the addresses.
Yeah.
It's on them to go
Right.
investigate it now.
Yeah.
Have them call witnesses.
Yeah. They in theory they should have that power, but do they have
Mhm.
like the fortitude to actually do
Yeah,
it? And that'll be interesting. I'm not going to be surprised if they don't have that fortitude, but
I agree.
we'll see.
Now, perhaps the most, to a certain mindset, the most damning bit of evidence against him is the DoD released a statement denying it. They
Hmm.
said, and I quote, to date, Arrow has not discovered any verifiable information to substantiate claims that any programs regarding the possession or reverse engineering of extraterrestrial material have existed in the past or exist currently.
Hmm. It's pretty
There's a
strong.
great quote. Yeah, there's a great quote from The Hill responding to this. They said, this may be a bit of clever wordsmithing. Grusch claims that staff of previous UFO analysis programs were not read in, that is, given access, to information regarding the kind of activities that he and others allege exist. As such, it's conceivable that, like its predecessor organizations, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, the Defense Department's current UFO analysis effort, is simply not privy to the alleged program. We did an article very recently called Is
Hmm.
Arrow Being Set Up to Fail? And talked about all of the little bits of damning evidence that Sean Kirkpatrick and his team are not being given what they need to do their job properly, ranging
Right.
from material, personnel, funding, and also
Access.
access. They
Yeah.
don't have Title 50 access. Well, if this shit is buried in the intelligence community and it is a illegal black op kind of thing, and Sean Kirkpatrick, agent of Congress, comes knocking on the door and says, "Hey, y'all got any UFOs in here? Fuck off, buddy."
Yeah. Right. So
And then
sure, they
Sean
haven't
gets to
found
go
it.
back to his boss and say, "We haven't found anything." And the DoD gets to come out and say, "Hey, our guy that we set up to not have access to find anything, guess what? He didn't find anything."
Right.
It sounds really good. It sounds like a good public proclamation, but they're very carefully saying the brand new, underfunded, underallocated, underprivileged office that we set up hasn't found anything.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't
Once you
say
start pulling it
we
apart,
chatted with all these people. We definitely have the
exactly.
access. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And it feels to me more like a cover your ass kind of statement. We can publicly say we haven't found anything yet. If Congress starts digging into it and they do crack this thing wide open, they can come back out and say, "Oh, well, we
Yeah.
didn't say it didn't exist. We said Arrow hadn't found it." Well, now, sure, if it was secret, of course they didn't find it.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so it kind of comes down to, do you trust the government? And I think it's become pretty clear by now that I don't have a whole lot of faith that the government is telling the truth on this
Hmm.
topic. And the weasel wording of this press statement kind of leads me to believe that it's suspect.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, press statements usually are. I think. Okay. Yeah, that sounded more
So I've got
damning
one
at
last,
first.
yeah. So I've got one last skeptical point to make here. And this one is courtesy of Mick West, a guy I avoid talking about because I find him intensely aggravating. But Mick
Okay.
West is like a professional skeptic. He's the
Okay.
kind of guy who like analyzes the GoPro video, the Go Fast video, and is like, oh, you know, due to some complicated math that no one but me understands, I've been able to prove that this thing was actually a balloon and it was going up and not to the left or whatever, right? Like,
Okay.
I find him super aggravating. But he asked a question that sounds reasonable. He says, David Grusch, his statements were cleared by DOPSR, which means they contain no classified information. How would the existence of a secret program to reverse engineer alien technology not be a classified program? It's a
Yeah.
reasonable question.
Yep.
Okay. Once again, the Hill article had a pretty excellent response to it. Said logic suggests that if a UFO retrieval and exploitation effort operating illegally, as is alleged, it would be unknown to the Pentagon's censors.
Hmm.
After all, if the pre-publication review office were read into such activities, it would likely have been exposed long ago. This kind of
That's
gets
really
back
interesting.
to the Admiral Wilson thing, right?
Yeah.
If Admiral Wilson, on paper, has access to everything, and he can't find it, and you ask Admiral Wilson, does this thing exist? And he says, I don't think it exists. And you say, is it classified? He says, well, it doesn't exist, so by definition, it can't be classified. You say, so can I talk about it? He'd say, yeah, I, I guess you can.
Yes.
You're in this weird loophole. Like, by definition, the illegally hidden program is not going to be part of the legal declassification process. It it is still a weird point. Kelly
Yeah.
Chase from the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast made a related point that I think was
Yeah.
interesting. She said this may actually have been intentional. Grusch, pointedly, has been clear. He has never laid hands on a craft or seen any bodies personally. Everything he is revealing is not classified information, it's hearsay.
Hmm.
Person X told me this. Person B showed me photo this. Person C says they work here. But all of it is, I heard this from this.
Yeah.
Um, Denying his request would be to acknowledge that what he says is classified and accurate. So, since it is all hearsay, you could argue that it's better to approve it and maintain plausible deniability. But this means that someone who did see a craft or a body probably would not be able to clear a DOPSR review
Hmm.
because they would be talking about something classified that they have a security oath about. So if they went public without it, they would probably get the Snowden treatment.
Hmm.
She has a quote here. She said, I would not be surprised to learn that Grusch, knowing that the whistleblower legislation was coming, purposely did not view any direct evidence of the
Hmm.
craft.
Yeah.
Everyone involved would have known that's the only way he could actually get away with going public with it. The goal was not to provide disclosure with full evidence. That's not possible. The goal was to create enough noise to trigger an investigation
Hmm.
that might be able to get at the evidence.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like wheels within wheels. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
God, that's such a process. Like uh, the whole like government inner workings. Like I see why people get entire like
Oh yeah.
degrees in this. Like it's
Hmm.
fucking complicated.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Now, the short answer is I don't know why his
Yeah.
statements cleared Dobbser. And as much as I dislike Mick, he is not wrong. It is weird to come out and say the Pentagon authorized me to talk about this secret illegal program. I think there are plenty of reasons you could think of why that's the case. I think probably the Hill hit the nail on the head, which is if it's illegal and hidden, by definition, the people who determine if it's a legal program that you can't talk about wouldn't be able to find it.
Yeah.
So it clears the review simply by nature of being too well kept a secret.
It does make me wonder how Dopser does their job. Like, do they
Hmm.
have clearance for every single compartmentalized
Hmm.
thing? Like, I don't know. That's
It's
really
it's a
interesting to
great
me.
question.
Yeah.
And it brings us all right back to the Admiral Wilson stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like on paper, he has access to everything. He is denied access. That's what he was pissed about. Not that it was a secret,
Hmm.
but that he didn't have access to the secret,
Yeah.
right? secrets exist. There's a chain of command for them and everything. But he was
Yeah,
at the top of that chain of command and was supposed to be privy to everything. And he found out they're keeping it from him.
yeah,
So
yeah. That is interesting. Okay, so here's I know running long, but would you work for Dopser?
I think this is a topic worth running a little long for.
Yeah,
Would I work for Dopster? No,
no.
no. I, we've talked about this before, right? Like
Yeah,
neither one of us would ever clear a security clearance
that's
thing,
true.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah, of course.
but you and I have different takes on that. We've talked about this before. Like you were like, I would not be able to learn it without needing to share it.
Yeah.
I think I could learn something and keep it secret, but I think it would make me miserable. And
Mhm.
frankly, I would rather not be exposed to the truth if I'm not allowed to talk about it and share it.
Okay, so
So,
here's my add-on question because we've had that
yeah.
question before. Would you be able to do uh, this thing that Grush just did, where you have witnesses coming forward with evidence, and you have to say, "Do not fucking show me the evidence. I need to be able to clear it off, sir."
I mean, it gets down to how clever do you think he's being, right? Like
Yeah.
if we agree with Kelly's proposal that this whole thing was, a three-dimensional chess move of him
Hmm.
outsmarting the establishment by finding a loophole in the ability to disclose, no, I don't think I would have been capable of thinking of the plan in the first place, let
Right.
alone executing on it.
Yeah.
If I came to you, I was like, Chuck, I found a loophole that means I don't ever have to pay taxes again. You would rightly be suspicious that I had actually found such a loophole and not
Mm.
just found the appearance of it. And I think you would probably rightly conclude within a few years, my good friend Scott is going to be in prison for tax evasion. Um, you know,
Yeah.
if I
Yeah.
was the guy inside the secret establishment going, oh, I found a way that I can do like, no, you didn't.
Yeah. It's interesting to me because some of the teams within my company have to purposefully avoid certain places. Like they aren't allowed to go to
Uh-huh.
Stack Overflow because Stack Overflow has a ton of GPL code on it. And they
Sure.
can't verify the source of that code, which means we may be accidentally importing this licensed code.
Mhm.
We can't do that. I just think it's fascinating that things like that exist. And it
Mhm.
sounds like there's something similar in this domain as well. I, I think I would really struggle with that to know that I
That-
could have all the goodies and have to refrain. Oof, that'd be
Yeah,
rough.
that'd be really, really rough. Yeah.
Strong convictions on that guy if he actually if he
Hmm.
he was able to make that happen. It's wild.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what comes of it.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, let's wrap up a little bit because that was
Okay.
Monday, and I and Chuck and I have been texting each other every day, every time like a new little tidbit drops or someone says something witty on Twitter. Um, there were two jokes that I sent Chuck that I thought were particularly clever. In the R Aliens forum, someone just posted a headshot of Bob Lazar, and the title was just "How You Like Me Now."
Yep.
And the other one was the I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens guy.
It's
And it was the
aliens.
same thing. Like, I'm not saying I told you so, but I told you so.
Yeah. I love that XKCD had this too.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
So yeah, a little bit of what's coming up. I mentioned there's a rumor of a New York Times story dropping soon.
Mhm.
Ross Coulthart on his podcast talking to Bryce Zabel, they mentioned that Ross spoke to Dave Grusch, recorded 7 hours of interview footage with him.
Wow.
Now, over the course of this week, News Nation has released little snippets here and there. They've been covering the story, but they haven't put out the big interview yet. So tonight at like 9 p.m., that is supposed to drop. That is supposed to be an hour-long edited version of the interview. But Ross has committed on his podcast that the full unedited 7 hours will be released at some point. He's working on figuring out the logistics of it. Obviously, they've been very focused on like, let's just
Yeah.
get it published first, but
Right.
once the hour-long video drops tonight, Ross has been very clear that there are additional claims that Grusch makes in that interview
Mm.
that he has not made in the
Okay.
debrief article. Um, there have been rumors all week about what this is. Someone on Reddit linked to a French language article that
Mm.
claims to have additional information. I haven't bothered to take the time to look up whether it was legit or not, but that article made the claim that one of the earliest UFOs recovered was actually from the 30s and was
Oh.
stolen from Mussolini's troops in Italy during World War II.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I guess if it was the 30s, it wasn't World War II, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like we're not just talking 1947 Roswell is kicking this off. Like apparently this has been going on for a while.
Hmm.
Like I said, I don't know if that French article is legit, so I'm not reporting it. I'm just sharing it.
Yeah.
The other thing is Ross has strongly implied that Dave Grusch is going to get into talking about the cover up aspect of this. So far, we've been very focused on the political theater aspect of inappropriate reporting to Congress, inappropriate, military procurement, very, very boring stuff. But
Yeah.
anybody who's been talking about UFOs for any amount of time knows that we're about to get into the X-Filesy side of it of if there is a secret and it has been a national secret, they have been protecting that secret. To what degree have they aggressively pursued this? If you were going to leak information about the nuclear bomb in World War II, they would have executed you for treason and they wouldn't have
Mm.
thought twice about it.
Right.
The rumor that we've been hearing for years is that they have treated everything around UFOs with a similar degree of seriousness. And these
Yeah.
quotes about asymmetric warfare, I think, kind of drive it home to
Yeah.
to a certain military establishment kind of viewpoint. The existence of a potential for asymmetric warfare is game over.
Yeah.
If it's not us, it's game over. So therefore, anything is permissible to suppress this. So I suspect we are going to get some quotes from Grusch talking about the cover up. Bare minimum, we're going to be talking about illegal efforts by the intelligence community to manipulate and mislead the American public. We may be getting up to and including things like assassinations. Who knows? That's all speculation, but
Right.
the hour-long interview drops tonight. 7-hour-long interview will drop later.
That's
Ross
wild.
has also been clear that there are more whistleblowers waiting in the wing. The actual language he used, I didn't write it down. I'm kicking myself now. It's something along the lines of, if they somehow neutralize Dave Grusch, don't worry, we've got more people who are coming forward.
Okay. Yeah.
Which kind of tells you a little bit about where Ross's head is at
Yeah.
on
Right.
this topic.
Yeah.
We have been talking for weeks now about upcoming House UAP hearings.
Yeah.
That was already in the news. Tim Burchett has been all over talking about criminal conspiracies and cover-ups, and
Yeah.
we're going to investigate it. Well, they have now explicitly addressed, yes, the whistleblower is going to come up in those hearings. They are proceeding as planned.
Okay.
Tim Burchett gave a quote to Fox. He said, "We are not alone, and we will get some answers." And I talked to that man yesterday, and we're hoping he'll be at the hearing as well. But we've been planning this for some time. So as far as Tim Burchett is concerned, like, done deal. This is the thing I've been saying, and everyone said I was crazy, and here's the guy.
Yeah. Right.
So I'm still very excited about potential House hearings. So I've got kind of a closer here that I want to share, but before I do, man, I have been talking at you for an hour and a half now. This is a big story. I had a lot to share. How are you feeling about it, man? This is buck wild.
It's totally wild. I mean, it's wild enough that I actually shared it with some friends. Like that's just unheard of.
Hmm.
I'm still kind of not in the closet, but like
Yeah, yeah.
a little bit, a little bit. So
I
this
was
is
at the funeral yesterday. My brother-in-law leaned over across the pew. He was like, "So, big week for someone with a UFO podcast, huh?"
oh, that's so good. Yeah. So as I honestly, I don't know how to feel. Excited, terrified, like all of these things. Um, Also unsurprised. I
Yeah,
still feel like it's like, yeah, obviously there's UFO, but also um, obviously we haven't figured it out. It's like 100% unsurprising to me that we wouldn't understand this.
I think you hit the nail on the head there about like both this is shocking and also not surprising. I think part of that is for the last 6 months, especially, but for the last 5 years since the New York Times article, there has been a slow drip feed of
Hmm.
everything that Dave Grusch said.
Hmm.
Never quite in an actionable format, but we have heard crash retrievals,
Yeah,
UFO reverse engineering, non-human intelligence, illegal cover-ups, black ops programs, all
right.
of this stuff has been things that have been brought up in some form or another to more or less serious tones. So it almost feels like there was a deliberate effort over 5 years to prime the pump. Okay,
Yeah,
the public
I
isn't
think that's
ready to
true.
hear the big news yet, but we can kind of like lay the groundwork. All the serious people will still hold back, but we're shifting the Overton window away from UFOs as a topic is crackpot to there's a serious angle of UAP and also increasing. I mean, it's in the freaking intro to our show, right? Like, if
Yeah,
this is real, what else? Like, that was
yeah.
the whole thing that got us talking. If UAP are real and flying around, well, now we have to talk about
What does that mean?
abductions and crop
Yeah.
circles and
Hmm.
like all these related topics that before I would have said were crazy, and now I'm like,
Yeah.
well, if this part isn't crazy,
What else?
what comes with it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's I hadn't even connected that. That's wild.
yeah.
Yeah.
So a guy on Reddit, I think, put what everything I just said much more eloquently. This dude's name is Joey is not my name. I'll have him linked in the references. But he says, listen, you guys are not understanding this. For the past 5 years, the narrative has been there are things in our sky we can't explain, and the government has been investigating them for years. We need to eliminate stigma and set up proper reporting channels because this is a flight safety issue, right? That was the
Mm.
safe way to talk about it. The narrative was structured around this way to bring up the stigmatized topic and get it taken seriously.
Right.
They've spent 5 years kind of like establishing the structural framework of the topic so we can talk about it without being laughed out of the room. Now that narrative has done some pretty remarkable things in 5 years. It led to major milestones like the first congressional UFO hearings in 50 years, the establishment of ARROW, whistleblower protections, and much
Yeah.
more, right? And we've talked about all of this very recently, but like the last 5 years compared to the previous like 50 have been a roller coaster ride. But David Grusch marks a significant step forward towards disclosure with a capital D. We
Mm.
are now plainly and openly talking about crash retrieval, reverse engineering, cover ups, and non human intelligence. And I think you're totally right that, like, this isn't disclosure is done.
Yeah.
This is the start of it. But I think it's really notable that unless something happens that completely torpedoes David Grush's credibility, this is the turning point,
Mm.
right? 5 years from now, we will be looking back at it and going, that was clearly the point where the tone of the conversation changed from avoiding the giggle factor to
Right.
we're taking it seriously.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can't predict the future, but holy shit, this sure feels to me like this is a tipping point
Yeah.
towards something big.
It's an important like week right now. And
Yeah,
yeah, culmination of a lot of work over probably 20 years, right? Like,
absolutely.
yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, and you know, maybe it has been engineered. Maybe they have been slow rolling the topic out, and this is like, you know, some media professionals, you know, senior project was getting this done. But it's it's really hard to avoid the looking at it and not seeing this as a trajectory.
Yeah, I like to imagine Lou Elizondo with the Monty Burns fingers, like orchestrating things for years. 'Cause he was high enough level. I bet he could do that kind of thing.
All right, buddy. You could not have set me up better for this. Lou gave a quote years ago, back when he was first coming out, um, addressing skeptics, and and also addressing true believers who were
Hmm.
frustrated with the pace of it, because he was one of the
Yeah,
ones who was saying, like, look, I'm under oaths. I can't tell you the things I know, but I am here to try to get this stuff out into public, and I'm
yeah,
working with Congress, and it's gonna take time. And what he said to me was like, if you're looking for change in this topic, go do something else. Go get a hobby and check in 5 years.
yeah, yeah.
Well, here
Yep.
we are, Lou. It's 5 years later, and I gotta say, my man, you've delivered.
Yeah, right? Yeah. That's perfect. Was that
Isn't
quote
it great?
actually from 5 years ago, or because
I would
that would
have to
be
go look it up.
alarming?
It was at least 3 or 4, but I'm pretty sure it was the year that he came out. It would have been around 2017.
How amazing would it be if it was like 2017, June 11? It's like, yeah,
Right?
five
Yeah,
years.
like to the day.
Yeah,
Oh man. So anyway, yeah, it has been a buck wild week. We're releasing
yeah,
this episode early. I have no idea what the show schedule will be. It might be that
yeah.
we go dark until Chuck's back in town because nothing in particular has happened. It might be that I'm putting out a podcast tomorrow because that
Yeah,
hour-long Ross Coulthart video blew up the world. Who knows? Stick
yeah,
with us. We will be talking about it to the degree that we can as there's
yep,
news to share. Because
yeah, totally.
holy shit, man.
This is wild.
This is absolutely wild. Chuck, as always, man, I got to thank you for talking to me about UFOs so my wife doesn't have to.